So there's that dream project in the future. There's a fairly solid idea of how to accomplish it. And then you realize you need to find the correct fabric. And how much of that correct fabric do you need? So many questions. So with Cinderella's ball gown, it's even more of a challenge because based on what Sandy Powell and others who worked on the project say, there are 270 yards of fabric to source. So the questions are, how many fabrics make up this 270 yards? What type of fabrics? How many yards of each specific fabric is needed? There are really just so many questions in trying to make this ball gown, just period. But in regards to the fabric alone, there's just a lot of questions to find answers for. But really, I guess it's to be expected because, I mean, just look at the dress. Something that amazing and stunning needs and should have a complicated explanation. In this video, I am going to do my best to answer those questions, though I will say my answers are not going to be 100% spot on correct. I haven't seen the dress in person, nor have I touched the dress, nor have I spent hundreds of hands-on research with the dress. But after making 5 Cinderella ball gown replicas and spending hours of computer screen research, I've learned so much. And with this trial and error, I've discovered some pretty good answers for these fabric questions. I'm just gonna pop in here real quick and tell you that if you haven't watched my Cinderella breakdown videos, now would probably be a really good time to do so because some of the things I bring up might not make quite sense or I might lose you. So you can check out the links for those videos up above here and also down below in the description. Also, I've arranged a little PDF download that will contain all the numbers and how much fabric for each layer and all that. I don't have a price on it. You can download it for free. I do have a little tip box on the page if you wanted to give a little to help compensate me a little for my time in preparing the PDF and all that. But honestly, with how many numbers I'm going to throw out here in this video, it would be rude of me not to provide a little paper handout to help you keep track of it all. So really, if you want to download that, be sure to go do that. You might even want to do it before you continue watching this video. It's just down below in the description. So with that, let's look at the 270 yards of fabric that goes into this stunning ball gown. So there are 5 to 6 outer full-length layers to the skirt. These are broken up into 3 outermost top layers and 2 to 3 underlayers. I've decided to go with 3 underlayers, so in total 6 layers. The very top layer is silk crepeline. The second layer is Yumissima in a aqua blue color. The third layer again is Yumissima but in a lilac-y color. And the fourth layer is iridescent nylon. The fifth and 6th layers are white and are most likely organza, probably silk organza. Based on photos, I believe the 3 outermost layers all have the same yardage, whereas the 4th layer, the nylon layer, appears to have less width and thus less yardage. And then layers 5 and 6 look like they have a bit more width than layer 4. You can see that there's more movement in those layers than the iridescent number 4 layer. With that information, and based on the fact that these layers are gored skirts, I've decided to make each layer except layer 4 with 9 gores. In order to create these 9 gored skirts, I will need approximately 17 yards of fabric for each of these layers. But for layer number 4, I'll be doing 7 gores, and this means I'll need about 13.5 yards. If I add all those numbers up, I've got a total of 98.5 yards in these 6 outer skirt layers. So subtract that from 270 yards, there's now 171.5 yards to figure out. Let's take a look at the petticoat layers. I'm gonna go from the inside to the outside with these layers. The base layer, layer number 1, is either a heavyweight organza or silk organza. A lower tier is added to this layer and it looks to be the same iridescent nylon as the skirt layer. Then there's another full-length layer, layer number 2, in the same fabric as layer number 1. This layer has 2 lower godet layers, and the inner one is kind of hidden and it's a lilac-y purple color, and the outer one is blue. For the outer layers of the petticoat, they are full length, and if you watched the breakdown video, which you should have, it's a toss-up whether or not there are 2 or 3 of these full-length layers. But I have decided to go with 3, So that's how I'll be calculating the yardage when it comes to these layers. So now let's figure out the actual yardage we need for each of these petticoat layers. So layer number 1 needs roughly 3 yards of fabric, and the lower tier that gets added to this layer needs about 6 yards, and then petticoat layer 2 needs about 4 yards of fabric. Layer number 2 has 2 godet layers attached to it, and so the inner one needs about 3 yards and the outer one about 5 yards of fabric. So now going on to layers 3, 4, and 5, which are the full length layers, we need approximately 10.5 yards for each of those layers. Before I add up all those yards and figure out how much we've deducted from the total amount, I'm first going to slash out these two amounts because these 2 godet tiers can be made out of leftover fabric from creating layers 3, 4, and 5 of the petticoat. So with that amount taken out, adding up the rest of the yards gives a total of 44.5 yards for these petticoat layers. So subtract that number from the total yardage we're working with, and the total tells us that there's still 127 yards still to be figured out, and there's only a couple things left, the frills and the bodice. So as for the bodice, it will only have about 1 yard in it. The fabric making up the poofy bertha will come out of leftover bits from making the skirts and such. So there's only 1 yard to take out, which leaves us with 126 yards for the frills or flounces. Something I wanted to point out, from making the skirt and the petticoat layers, there'll be a lot of leftover scraps that can be easily turned into frills or flounces, but I'm not really even going to try to figure out how many of those frills, flounces, those scraps will make. So they're just going to be what I call bonus frills, and they're just not going to be in the total. As I brought up in the breakdown video, these frills are actually flounces, which means instead of being cut on a straight piece of fabric, being gathered up, and that creates the frilliness. A flounce is cut on a curve, like the edge of a circle, and when it's straightened out, it creates that frilly movement at the bottom, and you don't have to gather it. But based on photos, there are still some gathers to the flounces, though not as much as a frill would need to create that same amount of frilliness at the bottom, if that makes sense. So they took the flounce, gave it a little gather, did this for however many hours that they did, and that created the jumbo amount of fluffiness of the petticoat. Easy. So thanks to pi, circumference, and diameter, I've been able to calculate how long of a frilly fluffy flounce I can make with a yard of fabric that's 55 inches wide. So as it turns out, I can make a length of a flounce approximately 5 yards long. This is ungathered though, so based on how much I plan to gather, which really isn't a lot, I'm going to say that this 5 yard of flounce will be gathered down to about 3 yards. So for curiosity's sake, let's look at how many yards of finished flounces we can create with that 126 yards of fabric we have. So 3 times 126 yards gives a total of 378 yards of finished flounces. So now let's see if that's enough flounce for this petticoat. So quick note, I've decided that with each petticoat layer, there will be 2 layers of frills attached to the edge. So there's the edge of the layer, and then I'll layer 2 flounces together and sew them to that single petticoat layer edge, and so on and so forth for each layer. With that aside, I estimated the circumference of each of these petticoat layers to the best of my abilities. We shall find out how close I am to those calculations. But anyway, layer number 1 will have a circumference of about 5 yards. So with 2 layers of flounces attached to the edge, I'll need about 10 yards of flounces. The lower tier of this layer will have 2 edges to it, and each edge is around 6 yards. So 12 yards of edge to attach 2 layers of flounces to means I need 24 yards of flounces. Layer number 2 will have a circumference of around 6 yards, so with 2 layers of flounces on the edge, 12 yards flounces needed. The inside lower godet tier of this layer will have a circumference of around 7 yards, so times 2 flounce layers means 14 yards needed. And then the second godet layer, the blue godets, will have a circumference of around 10 yards, so times 2 layers means 20 yards. Now for layers 3, 4, and 5, each will have a circumference of around 12 yards, so that's 36 yards of edge, times 2 layers of flounces means I need 72 yards of flounces. So that's a lot of numbers. So now let's add all those up. 10 plus 24 plus 12 plus 14 plus 20 plus 72 equals 152 yards of flounces that I need to cover all those petticoat layers' edges. So good news, it's looking like 378 yards of flounces made up from that 126 yards of fabric is way more than I actually need. But I'm really not even gonna try to remedy this problem because one thing I've learned in my past 5 Cinderella dresses is that fact that even though math is extremely helpful and confusing sometimes, once I actually get into the thick of it, I do what needs to be done to create the correct look. So if I end up adding more frills and using a total of 378 yards of finished flounces, and I'm secretly hoping I do, then I've used 270 yards of fabric in this dress, and if not, then okay. Once I make the petticoat, I will update all of you on how many flounces I used and if my estimated circumference of each petticoat layer is actually correct, because I really just made it up with a little bit of estimation. But anyway, now I think it's finally time to leave the numbers behind and look at the actual fabric I plan to use for these layers and frills and everything. Just kidding, because we're actually bringing some of those numbers along with us because, well, that is why I brought them up in the first place. I didn't want to just spew a bunch of numbers for no good reason. So we're using those numbers to help calculate how many yards of each fabric we're going to need to make this ball gown. For the outer layer of the skirt, I purchased 20 yards of this silk crepe line. It's white and it needs to be a cornflower blue, so dyeing is in the near future. Not dying, but you know what I mean. I only need 17 yards of this, but to be safe, I brought extra. And the outer layer of the bodice, as well as the bertha, will have some of this same fabric, but I'll be using scraps for that. So the extra 3 yards is really just playing it safe. Now for the next layer, it's Yumissima fabric, which I actually bought, and you can find a whole video of me playing with it, and it's just amazing. So I purchased 16 yards of this blue, and it's supposed to have a little more of an aqua tint to it, but they didn't have the right color, so I am totally fine with this blue. It's gorgeous. But anyway, because of the expense, I not only didn't buy extra to be safe, but I knocked it down a yard, so I'll be squeezing all the skirt pieces into 16 yards of this. I'll also be using the extra bits of this fabric for one of the bertha layers, and I'll be selling the extra. And the third layer of the skirt is also Yumissima, but in this gorgeous lilac purple. It's perfect color. Again, I bought 16 yards to save money, and I'll be using the scraps, very expensive scraps, for another layer of the bertha. So now we come to the fourth layer. Let me get it out. This is the iridescent nylon layer. I purchased this fabric, which is actually called Lunar Pearlized Iridescent Organza, but it's basically the same thing. I need 13.5 yards of this for the skirt layer, but let's just round that to 14 yards. I also need 6 yards for the lower tier of petticoat layer number 1. Plus, I plan to make a fair amount of flounces with it, so about 10 yards for that. So adding that up, I'll have about 30 yards of this that I'll use. Now for skirt layers 5 and 6. I need a total of 34 yards for both of those layers, but I also need 7 yards of the same fabric for petticoat layers 1 and 2. So that comes to a total of 41 yards. So I was kind of hoping that I could make all these layers out of silk organza, but that's a lot of silk. So here's where my budget and what I have in stock comes into play. I am only going to use 7 yards of silk organza, and this will be for my 2 petticoat layers. Silk organza is stronger than poly, and I want these layers to hold up to the weight of all the flounces and stuff. So I'll be using silk organza for those. But for the skirt layers 5 and 6, I'm going to use this white poly organza. It's a pretty nice poly. It's not like, it doesn't feel cheap, but at the same time, it's not silk. But I also don't want to buy 34 yards of silk for underlayers that you hardly see. So yes, I'll be making the skirt layers out of this poly organza, and silk organza will be used for the petticoat. Now for the other layers of the petticoat, we've got 1 and 2 layers covered, as well as the iridescent lower tier. And as I mentioned earlier, the Godet lower tiers will be made out of leftover fabric from these full-length layers. There are 3 layers, 2 of them blue and 1 purple, each needing about 10.5 yards of silk organza, a total of 31.5 yards. Again, here's where a budget and what I have in stock comes into play. I have 2 silk organzas that were purchased for other projects that just ended up not happening, so I'll be using them for this. So I have 18 yards of this dark blue silk organza. It's a bit dark, but I'm gonna make it work. And then I have 8 yards of this blue, and it's really the perfect color. That only makes 26 yards total, which is 5.5 yards short. But for now, I'm going to start with this and see what happens. I'll then purchase exactly how many yards I need to complete those layers, or, I mean, maybe it'll just work out because that'd be really nice. Wait a minute, why am I using silk organza for these underlayers? I thought I just said that for a layer that's unseen, why spend the money on silk organza? Well, the strength factor comes into play here also, and since these layers have some flounces attached to the bottom, I want them to hold up to the tugging and possibly stepping on them, and all that might happen when wearing the dress, so that is why I've chosen to go the silk organza route for these layers. But if you find a strong organza that holds up well, I would say that's a fine substitute for these very long, a lot of fabric layers. So again, those Godet layers will be made out of the extra bits of making those big skirts, but also I hope to make several yards of flounces from these silk organza scraps as well. So we'll see how many that turns out to be. So now with the petticoat and skirt layers, we've mostly have those covered, and now we're going to talk about the fabric for the flounces. So based on my calculations, we only need about 150 yards of finished flounces, which means we need about 50 yards of whole fabric to make them. To add to the dimension of the petticoat, a lot of colors and different types of fabric need to be used. And so I've already set aside 10 yards of the iridescent fabric for the flounces. And then I have these fabrics, which have fallen over the place. Okay, so I have 5 yards of this blue poly organza, 7 yards of this silvery gray poly organza, and 6 yards of this aqua poly voile. So on top of that, I have 30 yards of each of these and 20 yards of this one. With all that combined, I have more than enough fabric for the flounces, but so far I only have poly organza, this iridescent fabric, and some random silk organza flounces. So I'll actually be setting aside the bulk amount of these colors, and I'll probably only use like 3 to 10 yards of each and make that work, and that way it'll leave room for another type of fabric, which is tulle. Yay! I really don't like tulle, but it does play a nice supporting role in this petticoat. It gives great volume, plus when mixed with these other fabrics, it creates a really nice blending effect to all the petticoat and the flounces and stuff, but it does need to be used sparingly, like very sparingly. Too many layers of tulle all close together kind of create a clumping effect, and it's just not great. So I am very grateful to my past self who made way too many frills for a Cinderella dress, and because of that, I now have these bags filled with already made tulle frills. So they are frills, not flounces, but I'm okay with this because they're going to be used sparingly anyways, and they still have a nice look to them. FYI, if you ever want to store frills anyway, put them in a trash bag or something and leave the end out, and so you can easily find the end and use it for your next project. Because if I didn't do that and had to search through all this to find the end, never mind. Again, I will update you all on the exact number of flounces and how many yards I used and what types of fabrics I used and the yardage and all that as I continue on with this project. And one last thing, which I nearly forgot, the 1 yard of fabric for the bodice. So thanks to a certain person who actually worked on the dresses used in the real movie, I received a description from her about the bodice layers. So here it is. The bodice was a brocade with some iridescence in the threads. It was ombre dyed, and then 1 layer of crepe line. And it was all backed with fine linen. So I've always layered different fabrics to create my Cinderella bodices. I would use a blue base fabric like a cotton twill, and then added a layer of the iridescent fabric. And then on top of that, I would add a layer of the silk skirt fabric. But after reading her comment and seeing a brocade with iridescence, it kind of confused me. I don't know what, like a brocade. But when you look up at the close-up photos of the bodice, you can see that almost wrinkle look to that under fabric. So I'm guessing that wrinkle is the brocade weave maybe. So when I was searching for this fabric, I tried to find a brocade with that wrinkle look, plus iridescence. It was really hard to find, so the ombre dyed part just kind of left my mind. I didn't worry about it. So this is the fabric that I found for that bodice layer. The crinkles aren't quite right. They're a bit large, but I'm hoping I can make them work or maybe slightly iron them to make them smaller. I don't know. But I happened to do another quick search and I found some promising fabric on mood.com. The problem is it's white. It does have the iridescence and it has that small bubble look, so I would need to dye it, and I could do the ombre dyed look to that. But I just don't know if I'm going to do that yet. We'll see what happens. Anyway, I think that wraps up this figuring out fabric video with a lot of numbers. Again, you can find that download for all the numbers and the types of fabric and such down below, and I hope that serves you well and helps you in the process of finding fabric. As always, a huge thank you to all my patrons, old and new, who are supporting me in this journey. You will forever receive my gratitude. But if you'd like to learn more about Patreon and become part of that journey, you can find the link up here and down below in the description. So with that, wish me luck for the current step of making all those flounces, and I will see you next week with another sewing adventure. So now go into your own sewing area and learn, create, and inspire.